welcome back to Kim Reads as we continue with Phantom. In order to arrive at Nizhny Novgorod before the end of the Great Yarmark, as its famous summer fair was known, I was obliged to cross the Caspian with precious little delay. Rivers travel at a leisurely pace on the back of a camel, and on that tale that had excited the Cotton's bored imagination have been the best 12 part of the 12 months in reaching us. I had no time to assemble the elaborate entourage so beloved of the traveling Persian. I took with me a mere handful of servants, among them my trusted Darius, and we traveled lightly as possible in the interest of speed. I prefer to forget as much as I can about the sea crossing, which was surely as disagreeable as any crossing could have been. The summer storms were unimaginably bad, and our summer vessel was tossed about like a piece of driftwood. I was in a violent humor by the time we reached Astrakhan. The first thing I noticed about this famous Russian town was not the towering minarets of its dozen mosques or the graceful cupolas of its innumerable churches, but the disgusting smell of decaying fish, which seemed to pervade the whole city. I retired at once to a mean-looking, insubstantial wooden lodging house, leaving Darius to arrange our passage up the Volga by steamer. The landlady served a meal which seemed to consist chiefly of cabbage soup, cucumber, watermelon. I was gazing at this noxious fare, trying to decide whether I dare send a mouthful down to my outraged stomach, when Darius returned looking anxious. The great Yarmark at Nizhny had only a few more days to run, and the steamer on which he had accordingly booked our package was due to leave at noon. Abandoning the watermelon in disgust, I watched our baggage bump unceremoniously down the rickety staircase. The indignation of our landlady was extremely vocal. When Darius joined me at the waterfront, I know that there were streaks of cabbage soup on his robe. If I had been furious, I would have been amused. I suppose a leisurely trip on the Volga is a pleasant thing to those who are not burdened by severely limited time and a nerve-wracking sense of urgency. Certainly my fellow Muslim travelers appeared to be enjoying themselves. 5 times a day I joined them on the paddle box of the steamer to turn my face to Mecca and prostrate myself in prayer. But I am ashamed to admit that my mind often wandered from the ritual invocations. There was no thought in my head except the success of this mission, for only success would buy me a swift passage to my son. We had arrived far later than I first calculated, and I knew that the time was against me now. Cursing the stately pace of steamer, I paid a visit to the engine room to inquire whether or not speed could be increased. All I received for my pains was a lecture on the mechanics of steamer navigation and a tart reminder that the things had been far worse in the days of the old Machininas, which had only been recently receded from the waterways. Didn't I realize that it used to take many weeks to complete this journey, as it now took days? Admire the scenery and be patient, advised the old captain. I wasn't interested in the scenery. The wooded hills of the Jiguli, the idyllic coves and bays were quite lost on me as I stared unseeingly into the distance, willing the boat to make greater speed. 1,600 miles stretched endlessly before me as the day slipped away like sand in an hourglass. Saratov, Samara, Kazan. And then at last, the square whitewashed monastery of St. Marcius loomed up on the right bank, and I realized with my intense excitement that I was usually within 5 hours of my goal. Laden Heavily laden barges were moving up and down the congested river on either side of us, often passing so close that it was a miracle we avoided a collision. The country on the right bank had assumed a new aspect, a high, mountainous ridge now rising abruptly from the plain below. We turned sharply to avoid a sandbank, and at that point I was afforded my first glimpse of Nijini's imposing setting. I saw the gilded cupola of the cathedral and the white crenellated wall of the ancient Kremlin. The old town was reposing serenely under the shadow of its fortress, as though mildly surprised by the frenzy of activity that was taking place on the river below. Later, I was to think how much Nijni Novgorod resembled the man that I had come to find. Aloof, formidable, full of astonishing contradictions. When we disembarked on the quay side, I sent my servants to acquire lodgings in the Hotville. I waited only long enough to ascertain the inn address before hiring a drosky boy to drive me through the town on the western quarter, which I was told. Darius came with me, insisting that the fair was full of thieves and rogues, and that it was not safe for a gentleman to venture into the throng alone. Throngs there certainly were. The little Tartar horse could barely make headway against the tide of traffic that was sweeping out of the fair. No Persian bazaar could compare with this chaos. Crowds on foot, in carriages, and on horseback, droves of cattle, carts laden with jars and casks, and boxes of every description, all served to hamper our progress, and I was amazed to see such activity so late in the day. Rain teemed down steadily, and the horse was up to its fetlocks in a quagmire of mud that suggests such torrential downpours were a depressing regular occurrence. But neither the rain nor the mud discouraged the remarkable number of devotes. On virtually every street corner that we passed, there was a sacred sign or image surrounded by hysterical men and women, all flinging themselves down in the mud before the lighted candles and crossing themselves with feverish urgency as though their lives depended on the gestures. Christians, said Darius beneath his wrath, and in his voice I heard all the ancient contempt of Islam for the unbeliever. I shared his beliefs, but not his contempt. I knew there was no God but Allah. I accepted that no infidel would ever be admitted to paradise. And yet I made many friends in the Catholic missions of Persia. Men whose moral integrity I respected, even though I pitied their religious misguidance. They had no hope of heaven, but here on earth, I saw them no reason to deny them civility or friendship. I could not hate the indiscriminate simplicity of my servant. So I made no response, and we rode on in silence, though perhaps rode is hardly the right word to describe our progress. We lurched from side to side, we were constantly jostled, almost overturned in the melee, and stinking mud was thrown up in our faces from all directions. At length, I was forced to admit we needed to abandon the road until the crowds lessened. The little drosky boy, a grimy-faced urchin, seemed delighted to relinquish the struggle and gladly directed us to an eating house, where we saw a passable dish of chicken and rice and unending pots of lemon tea. Returning to the streets an hour or so later, I was dismayed to find that, though the livestock and carts had disappeared, the numbers on foot had increased tenfold. It seemed to me that half of the world was bent on entering the western Faubourg tonight in search of food and entertainment. There was plainly no point in attempting to navigate our way through the press of bodies by horse and cart. I paid off a drosky boy and we continued on our way by foot. And at no time at all we were all lost. My Russian was not at all that it could have been, and my attempts to gain direction sent us on a long series of false trails. Most of the bearded merchants and grave-faced Orientals appeared to be as bewildered and confused as myself. It was some time before I managed to reach the famous Kunavan suburb. The area was situated at the farthest western extremity of the fair and was given our entirety to the pursuit of dubious pleasures. As darkness closed in, groups of drunken, riotous revelers lurched out of the eating houses and began to pick fights with each other on their way to the gambling dens and whorehouses. Darius took out his knife and urged me to seek shelter, but I struggled off his anxious, restraining hand. But I could not sleep tonight without discovering whether my prey had already flown. Fears were scattered throughout the length and breadth of Russia, and I felt cold with panic at the prospect of failure at Nijni. I was condemned by the imperial edict to wander this entire face of this huge, bleak country until I found the damnable magician. I would walk these streets all night if necessary before I abandoned hope of an early success. An hour later, I turned a corner and came face to face with the very eerie sight I was looking for. The Kyrgyz tent that had been described is painstakingly telled by the Sarkand fur trader. Oval-shaped like an enormous beehive, the huge black shadow seemed stark and rather sinister among its gaudy and disreputable surroundings. I was surprised and unnerved to find that, having struggled so far to come at this moment, my first impulse should be to turn and run. As I turned in the half-lit street, I was overwhelmed by a powerful presentiment of ill omen and tragedy, unlike anything I had ever experienced before. All my instincts warned me against stepping into that domed tent, which suddenly seemed so strangely and irresistibly threatening. My legs were like lead as I bade Darius remain where he was, and I hesitantly lifted the rush matting that served as a door. It was like stepping into a mysterious womb. Everything before my eyes was red. The walls, the rich Persian carpet on the floor, the pennants suspended from the concave roof. Soft, subdued candlelight and a heavy aroma of fragrant oils and incense made the atmosphere weigh down on me like an enchanting cloud. A strange, heavy lethargy began to creep over me, but I had to blink my clear head before I could focus on the man who inclined upon the hoard cushions. In stark contrast to the warm opulence of his surroundings, he was dressed from head to foot in black, and his face was entirely concealed behind a white mask. The effect suggested power, a cold and thrilling majesty, as though I had stumbled upon one of the most ancient gods of mythology. He did not look up when I entered, and for a long time he continued to tinker with an intricate trick casket while I hovered by the doorway, troubled by a growing sense of invisibility. He ignored me so completely that I began to be persuaded that he was quite unaware of my presence, and consequently I allowed myself to stare at him with vulgar curiosity. I could not help noticing his fingers, which were extraordinarily thin, scarcely more than bones. They were positively inhuman length, and they moved with a graceful skill and dexterity that was oddly fascinating. Memorized, I stood and stared, and I suddenly became aware that he was watching my stare. The scrutiny of those unblinking eyes behind the mask made me very nervous. There was something sinister, almost reptilian, in the stillness of that black-clad figure, something that reminded me comfortably of a cobra getting ready to strike. "The performance is over for tonight," he said in faultless Russian. "If you wish to see my skills, you must come back tomorrow." My mouth dropped open in astonishment, for nothing in his grim and austere appearance had prepared me for his voice. Even that cold, clipped comment, its astonishing beauty, was quite unmistakable. Only those who had heard him speak and sing will ever know just what a voice could be, for it was necessary to hear that extraordinary resonance and depth of timbre to truly understand that magnitude of its power. I never expected to hear such a voice outside paradise. To encounter it here in this drafty, ill-lit tent held its kind of terror. For who was he? What was he? To be possessed of such divinity of sound. That first moment when I first heard him speak, I wondered whether I beheld an angel or a devil. And even now, after all these years, it is a question I still ask myself. For each time I thought I finally knew the answer, he would only confound me once again. But that was in the future. Now there was only the present, and the need to gather my wandering wits in the face of brisk dismissal. I beg your pardon for this intrusion," I said hastily, lapsing into Persian in my own confusion. "Please understand that I do not come here simply as another credulous spectator, impertinent enough to expect a private performance." "You are certainly impertinent," he retorted coldly in my native tongue. "State your business with me and be brief." He spoke with me with the arrogance of a king, and involuntarily I found myself slipping into the automatic defense I normally reserved for the Shah. "Sir, your fame has carried you many miles, even farther than you may have imagined. I have come from Persia to extend to you the personal invitation of the Shah in Shah." Even as I spoke, I knew I was grossly exceeding my commission. I've been told to fetch this man in the same way as I might have been obtaining a performing monkey, but suddenly I was deeply aware this was not going to be easy. He laughed softly, a sound which made all the hairs on the back of my hand stand on the end. "So you think you can come and go on the whim of kings, like other men?" he challenged. "No," I said quietly. "I can already see that you are not like other men." He leaned back on the cushion, studying me with some curious emotion that I could not fathom. "You speak more truly than you know, Persian. You may do better to remain silent." He rose, and I felt cold with apprehension as he took a step forward to me. I knew that I had angered him, but I did not know how or why. "Suppose I choose not to accompany you to Persia. What will become of you? King's messenger?" The menace in his voice had been indescribable, and his physical nearness was a thing of terror. I was suddenly aware that nothing could save me now from his unspoken threat except scrupulous and painful honesty. If I fail in my mission, I shall lose my position in the court, my livelihood, and quite possibly my life, I told him simply. He was silent for a moment, regarding me thoughtfully, and I sensed he had begun to smile behind the mask. "What is your position?" he demanded unexpectedly. I made him an ironic little bow of courtesy. "I am the Daroga of Mazarjan." "I see." He folded his arms beneath the enveloping black cloak. "Then I may take it that the chief of police has come with armed men?" "No, sir, I come alone, save for a servant outside." "Allah, why was I telling him this?" He laughed again, but this time there was no heart-stopping, menacing sound. "That, if you will forgive me for saying so, is remarkably careless of you. I trust you to conduct your business with greater efficiency at home." His moods had changed abruptly with my ignoble confession. He was still playing with me as a cat plays with a mouse, but gently now with sheathed claws. Refusing to raise the bait, I maintained a dignified silence. And after a moment he shrugged and went to the corner of his tent, where there were water bubbling, was steady inside the brass urn of a samovar. Removing the little china teapot from the top of the charcoal, poured a single cup, added a slice of lemon, and offered it to me. I accepted this sacred Russian sacred gesture of Russian hospitality with great relief. In this country, tea was a natural preliminary to business. Indeed, a natural preliminary to all civilized negotiations. More agreements were struck in tea houses than anywhere else. So at least it seemed I was not to be thrown out of his tent without a full hearing. What does the Shah offer in return for my services? He inquired abruptly. I took a gulp of scalding hot tea for courage. Well, honor. He made the gesture of impatience as though these things were of no interest to him, and I took a breath as I baited my final hook. Power. He placed the teapot back on the charcoal and swung around to look at me. Power? The renaissance of his single word quivered in the air between us, and I knew that it struck the right chord. If you please the Shah and the Khana, your word would be law. For a time. I agreed, knowing it was useless to lie. But during that time, I spread my hands in an expressive gesture that was not wasted on him. Yes, he said slowly, I understand your meaning. Then you will come with me? If you agree, we could leave tomorrow. He snapped his fingers irritably. Your persistence begins to annoy me. You'll find that I don't care to be annoyed, not even by the Daroga of Mazardan. Go now. You will have your answer when I'm ready to give it, not before. I knew if I said another word, I should lose all the ground I had made, so infuriating though I was by his arrogant autocracy, I merely bowed and left him. My fate hung entirely on his whim, but I suddenly wished that I could come too late after all, that I had been unable to find him. I do not know what dreadful chain of events I had set in motion that night, but a deep uneasiness came upon me as I contemplated his presence in Persia. That sense of menace and ill omen was still with me long after I had left his tent. It dawned on me before I was able to sleep at night, and when I did learn his voice echoing through my restless dreams like an echo of doom. Okay, that's it for that chapter. See you next time.